Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this particular video I discuss politics based on the comments. Some of the most responded to comments that have appeared on the videos on this channel from the last week. So getting into the first one, this was regarding the fact that there's a number of former Conservative MPs and moderate Conservatives, senior members of the Conservative Party, but not aligned with Boris Johnson and certainly not aligned with Brexit, who are actively calling on voters, actually, we normally want you to vote Conservative, but on this occasion, could you not, please? A comment here is, problem is there are large swathes of the British public who think that the last 9 years of government have been expletive deleted, yet they lack the common sense to connect the dots between that and Conservative. It's not a big step, maybe they are too far gone. This is ultimately a thing that you see, yes. I've said this before, and I think I've said it in another video. The issue, I certainly said it to my girlfriend this morning, the issue with Boris Johnson, when you think about the things he's saying when he's campaigning, if I'd just woken up from a coma, and I've been in a coma for like 10 years, and I was listening to Boris Johnson saying what he's saying in this general election campaign, I would think that there was a Labour government and that he was the Conservative leader of the opposition. Because everything he is saying only works if, well, it may work actually regardless, but should only work, shall we say, if you are the leader of the opposition, because his whole tack is the country is in a right mess. It's all Labour's fault. Vote for me and I will fix it all up. But Labour aren't in government and they haven't been in government for 10 years. This is all as a result of the Conservatives in power. And if he actually wanted to fix the things that he says he does, why didn't he already do that? Why didn't the Conservatives in general already do that? That's the issue. I mean, that was very much the issue with Trump, I suppose, to a lesser extent. He was always saying, oh, you know, people are totally screwed over, blah, blah, blah. And you think, so what did you ever do about it? What did you ever do before? It's not like vote for me as president and I can sort a load of things out. Well, you could have sorted a load of things out as a very wealthy man. But the Conservatives have actually had political power, power over the UK budgets, power over Whitehall, power over laws for some of the time, certainly power over government policy. And yet these issues happened anyway. And yet it's working. You know, what I should be able to say is I should be delighted at Boris Johnson taking that tack. It's like, this is ridiculous. You're never going to get voted in saying all these things. It's nonsense because people know that the Conservatives have been in for all this time. They know it's your fault. I mean, in the first couple of years, you can sort of sometimes get away with blaming the party that was previously in government. Not 9.5 years later. But in actual fact, he still seems to enjoy a large amount of support throughout the country. Not always for this reason, but it does nonetheless suggest that there are a large number of voters who absolutely are not connecting the two. Oh, Boris Johnson's different. He's a different Prime Minister. Yes, but he's still a Conservative Prime Minister who actively worked in the previous administrations. He was a government minister and a close friend with David Cameron. He was intrinsically linked with the Conservatives that have been in government since 2010. But yeah, you know, you're saying there, you know, it's not a big step to connect the dots. Conservatives last 9.5 years, they're still the Conservatives now. Are we really going to give them another 5 years? Potentially. They are too far gone. These people are too far gone. It's like, what do you do with someone who cannot face up to something as simple as this? And it is ridiculous. It is. There it is. On to the next one. Says, all politicians speak with forked tongues. And I'd certainly say all senior politicians, to a certain extent, some worse than others. And Boris has turned the forked tongues language into a fine art. Therefore, how can any ordinary member of the public decipher anything he says? The safest bet is to believe nothing and no one and rely on what these politicians and their parties or governments have done in the past. That's the only reliable indicator. I certainly agree that actions speak louder than words. And in my case, you know, if a politician says, oh, I want to do this, this and this, I would definitely look at their voting record. Boris Johnson has been an MP long enough to have trends appear in his voting record. And yes, absolutely, we know he's not going to support public services. He's not going to help people get into work. He's certainly not going to help minorities in society to, be treated fairly. And he's certainly not going to do anything for women's rights either. But the problem with that is that although I think it's fairly straightforward to look at someone's voting history, their voting record, too many people, that's just effort. And they will only ever listen to what is actually needed, and this is unfortunate because we can't get it, is the media to hold politicians to account. When a politician says a thing, then the media need to say, yeah, you seem to be lying there. That's not actually true at all. And we have this, situation. I mean, you're right. Politicians on all sides have made a habit of at least misleading the public. But they've often in the past misled the public in the same way that a newspaper with a particular political bias would, or indeed anyone, in that what they'll say is the literal truth. But they will phrase it in such a way as to lead you to think a particular thing, particularly as they'll leave out other pertinent facts, thus, leading you to a particular conclusion. That's how it's generally done. You won't be able to point at anything they said or wrote and say that's a lie. You'll be able to point to it and say that's not balanced because you didn't include these pertinent facts, or you used this emotive language. It's not very objective, or, you didn't interview these people who are actually experts in this field. There are all sorts of things you can point the finger at there, but you wouldn't be able to say that they lied. However, there are some that do just straight up lie. And in the past, others have called them out for it. Boris Johnson is like a new breed in this country, very much in the mould of Donald Trump. I mean, effectively, always look for the common factor. Common factor between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Who mentored both of them? Steve Bannon. Ultimately, this is Steve Bannon politics, let's face facts. It really doesn't matter. The fact is that Boris Johnson is going along with it, and he is telling the most egregious lies. And they are easily provable. You can prove that they are lies. They're demonstrable lies, easy to prove. But I can't go around, and neither can, the other people who can easily demonstrate them, everyone in the country, and point people to them. And some won't listen anyway. They won't believe you or your source. And he's now worked out that because not enough of the media call him out, ultimately, Boris Johnson's behaviour is as a direct result of the lack of accountability. There are people just as self-centred as him that have been in political power before, but they haven't been able to get... I'm not saying all senior politicians were as bad as him, but they weren't able to get away with what he gets away with. He hasn't just come along and tried a new technique as such. He's just in an environment that allows for it. Before he would have been starved of credibility. Even 20 years ago, he'd have been starved of credibility. Now he's not. He's supported. And we do have a massive problem there. And I sort of would like to go along with this commenter that what we ultimately need is another way of deciding when a politician is telling the truth or not, because it is quite difficult for ordinary members of the public to really understand what he's talking about, because again, you have to dig a bit deeper to find out. The media should be there to provide that outlook. It's not. And unless I say to everyone, just read The Independent or something, you're not really going to get that objective view of it. What can you do? I agree that looking at their voting record would be a good way, but you still have to, even though when you look at someone's voting record, there are sites that sort of break it down by area and you can get a good overview there. You probably still need to dig in there and pick about with it. And that takes time and effort. And yes, I know you don't have to do it with a lot of people. Ultimately, you have to do it with the leader of the party and probably your own MP and other candidates. And you haven't got to do it with all 650, MPs that exist at the moment. But it is still a lot of effort for a lot of people. And a lot of people maybe don't even know you can just look at voting records. Or they may just naively think, well, a person can change. Do they? Not really. Someone can change their mind on certain issues when presented with facts, unlike people who support Boris Johnson. But most people, once they've reached full adulthood, they don't really change that much unless there's some great trauma in their life. And, you know, if a politician 10 years ago, or even 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, or this year, was voting against people's rights and they were voting against money for public services, this is not a person who is going to actually implement any policies that improve people's human rights or, you know, improve people's opportunities or improve public services or anything like that. What way is there for an ordinary person? There isn't, other than putting some effort in to really learn about the people involved in the politics that they want to vote on. And that requires the likes of us to explain it. It requires us to engage in debate, reasoned debate, not getting in a strop, you know, understanding, not treating people like the stupid, and just try and persuade them. That is ultimately all that can be, because the institutions in this country that should be providing that accountability are not doing. So it's for the rest of us to do so. All right, next one. I can totally see him getting humiliated by facts. This was in reference to the fact that I said that Boris Johnson should just go on these interviews, not just because I'm opposed to Boris Johnson. I want him made to look like a fool. I think he can get through them without looking like a fool to the people who would vote for him anyway, because that's the important thing. It doesn't matter if he looks like a fool to people who are not going to vote for him. It's only the people who, you know, want to. But anyway, it says, I can totally see him getting humiliated by facts. He can only pretend the false confidence he has on Brexit for so long. I'm not sure I agree. I've seen it all my politically aware life. Politicians, during times when the media would hold them to account. So, I mean, there were always parts of the media that would give them an easy ride. Murdoch papers would give an easy ride to whoever, you know, was his pick, or relatively speaking. But there was a great deal more accountability until recently. And so what you observed of political behaviour is the politician would know they were going to be asked questions on certain things. And arguably more difficult for a Prime Minister because they can be asked on a range of things. Whereas, let's say you're the Foreign Secretary, you know, whatever happens to be big news in foreign affairs at the moment is what they're going to ask you on. So you can go in prepared. And you know that when they ask you the questions, if they're going to write it up in an article, they're going to quote you. And I've said this in another video as well recently. And when they quote you, if you have only provided them with a small quote, then that's what they have to use. If you are asked a series of questions and you give full and complete answers, it's very foolish as a politician, because then they can pick and choose their quotes and they can put them out of context. You know, the usual thing where a politician says, oh yeah, I did say that, but it's taken out of context. I mean, most of the time that's rubbish. But some of the time it can. Yes, it can. Things can be taken out of context by unfriendly media. So what you do is you go in there with your quote. You've already worked out what you're going to say on any particular issue. Even if it doesn't answer the question, doesn't matter. You know, journalist comes up to you, you say what you want to say. And they say, right, okay, that's not really answering the question. I think you'll find it is. Let's just listen to it again. I'll just explain it again. Say the same thing again. Maybe you change a few words, but the same meaning is there. And then they say, okay. So then they try a follow-up question. Yes. But I think what you'll find is that and this is where you come on the general public are not that interested in the finer details. He's done that plenty of times, Boris Johnson. And what you say, I think what you'll find is that what the people are really interested is in this. And you repeat your answer and you do it ad nauseum until they just go away. And there's nothing they can do. There's nothing they can do. They can try and say, if you like, that you seemed a bit hesitant to go into the details. But as you will have already said, I think what the people would like to focus on is this. And you just say that. It's easy. Honestly, it is so easy. And he could absolutely do that. And you say he'll get humiliated by the facts. He will only get humiliated by the facts in the eyes of the people who already are not going to support him. Because these facts will be nothing new. So, no, I think... And you say he can only pretend the false confidence he has on Brexit for so long. You're missing the point of being raised by Eton. The Etonians have bred into them this confidence, this utter confidence. Boris Johnson exhibits it in spades. You will never dent his confidence at all. No amount of reality will do that. None at all. He will carry on and bluff and bluster, because you're imagining yourself in the same situation and you think, well, I would be ashamed to keep saying these things and eventually I would falter. Yes, me too. Not Boris Johnson. He's been conditioned from this since childhood. He will never falter on it. So, no, as much as guaranteed, if he did one of these interviews where he was actually, put to the test, Twitter would be alive. Lots of people I follow would be going, oh, Boris Johnson was totally destroyed. I wouldn't see a single person who was supporting Boris Johnson before this point going, do you know what? I was supporting Boris Johnson, but not after that. Not a single person would. The only people that would see it as a bad performance by him would be those who've already seen him for what he is. I don't think there's any further scales to fall from people's eyes in terms of that. So no, I'm going to stand by what I said and say that he could totally safely go on these things. The only reason I can possibly think why he doesn't is because he is considered, and I've said it before, not intelligent enough to be able to stick to these set quotes no matter what the question is, or to use the appropriate quote for the question so that it doesn't look too ridiculous in the eyes of his supporters. That can only be it. He's not trusted to have the intelligence. Next one. Says the BBC should hire Jonathan Pye to interview Tories as a mea culpa and balance things out a bit. Mea culpa meaning admission of guilt in this case. Jonathan Pye, for those who don't know, is a British comedian who puts on an act where he pretends to be a British journalist. He's very left-wing. And should hire Jonathan Pye to interview the Tories. That would be hilarious. I would love to see that. There is zero way that any one of them would allow themselves to be interviewed by this man, because it has to be said, although he's a fake journalist, he's a comedian that plays the part of a journalist, he would do a much better job of interviewing than the vast majority of journalists who've actually got the gig of interviewing him. And being left-wing, of course, he would be merciless. Absolutely merciless. I don't think they would do that. Well, Boris Johnson would definitely not agree to be interviewed by this person. Definitely not. I mean, we have a weird thing in this country, don't we, with like the interviews and the debates. I mean, for American viewers, I don't know what it's like exactly, but the way we started these TV debates, it wasn't something that happened when I was growing up or even when I was an adult for most of the time. It just suddenly started happening 10 years ago. And fair dues, people got involved, and you had Gordon Brown and you had David Cameron and Nick Clegg at the time, and, other party leaders as well. And it seemed like, this is a way of letting the public see the leaders debate their policies, and it sounded like a good idea. Very much copied off the style of debates in America between presidential candidates. I don't know whether there are wider debates between candidates for Congress or the Senate. Maybe someone can answer that one. But it doesn't work in this country. It doesn't work because there isn't enough of a weight of expectation. So Boris Johnson, for example, as Theresa May did as well, has gotten out of attending them. They haven't gone along to the debates. I would point that out as well to Conservative supporters. I would put it this way. That's now 2 leaders of the Conservatives who have refused to do debates. There is no other political party in this country whose leader has refused to go on one of these debate programmes. We've had different leaders of the other parties. And, the Liberal Democrats have had several leaders in the last 10 years. Labour have had they're on their 3rd. The Conservatives are on their 3rd. The SNP are on their 2nd. As the major parties go. And they've all of those parties, the leaders at the time have all been quite happy to go on these debates, except for the Conservatives. You should ask yourselves, why is that? Why is it that the Conservative leaders choose to go on interviews on these programmes? They don't mind doing interviews. but they won't do the debates. So they can't argue bias on the part of the broadcaster because they're going on interviews with the same broadcaster, in fact, demanding to do so. So what's that about? Maybe not Channel 4 in the case of Boris Johnson. What is that about? And it's because the other leaders will essentially tell the truth. Again, they may tell political truth, which is not necessarily the full truth. At the end of the day, it's not up to them to be objective. They are pushing for their party. But they'll effectively tell the truth, which means it's not that difficult to debate because you're presenting what you believe to be true. Whereas if you're trying to believe, you're trying to get yourself to project something you don't believe in, you know is a lie. It's very difficult to lie. It's very difficult to lie and keep up lies because you have to have, what do they say? They say to be a good liar, you need a very good memory. Whereas you don't if you're telling the truth because it's the truth. At least the truth as you understand it. So, yes, what I would say, obviously Boris Johnson would not, I know this wasn't a serious thing. It would be funny. There's no way he would do it. But what we ultimately need in this country is more of an expectation that you go on these things. If Boris Johnson were essentially forced to attend these debates, if it was expected, then that's the only way that we'll get proper engagement with them, I think. Okay, next one. So this comment said, well, what did people expect from an individual, Boris Johnson in this case, that once said, business, also regarding the foreign medical staff, so regarding the NHS here, what did they expect? Why would they stay in a place where the Brexit leaders present them as intruders and enemies? Coming from countries which had placed the UK in chains, I wouldn't visit England or Wales now as a tourist, let alone live there. Why would I go to a place where I'm not welcomed and pay money for it or buy British products? And yes, this is ultimately the point that many of us have tried to explain to our blinkered brethren in England and Wales particularly, but throughout the UK, let's not forget Northern Ireland and Scotland did vote significantly to remain, but there was a hell of a lot of people still voted to leave. It's disappointing everywhere. And it's what we've tried to explain is, yes, these are not our enemies, they are our friends. They, talking of the NHS, they do two things. First of all, there's so many doctors and nurses that come from the EU. We haven't got a queue of British doctors and nurses waiting at the unemployment office trying to find work because there's tons of vacancies. We've got 100,000 vacancies in the NHS, quite a lot of them for doctors and nurses. There's no doctor and nurse in this country that can't get a job on the NHS. So the obvious maths is if they leave, we have more vacancies. We can't fill them. That's the point. And Boris Johnson, we'll just train more. No, they're training fewer. They're training fewer because they're putting less money into, for example, I know for nurse training for a start, I know they're putting less money into it. They cut the funding on nurse training. How are you going to get more nurses? We can't even get enough nurses to fill the vacancies. How are we going to get enough to fill the vacancies that naturally exist, plus the extra ones, because we're telling the really hard-working EU nurses to piss off. We're making them feel unwelcome. The government, and this isn't just people as well, it was bad enough when it was. This is the government. My understanding, my clear understanding was that anyone, and this is the Conservatives that said this, anyone that was currently living and working in the UK, that was an EU citizen from a different EU country, when we leave, will get settled status. There'll be no issues about it. If you're living and working here, we don't want to kick anyone out. They were saying they just want to stop more people coming in, which they could have anyway, by the way. EU rules don't prevent that. Other countries in the EU control the amount of immigration. This is nonsense. You can travel. The whole point of being in the EU, sure, you can travel, and yes, you can live and work and all the rest of it. But if that government wants to sort of control the number of people living there, it can. But anyway, that's one side of it. And then the other aspect with the NHS, of course, is even the people not working in the NHS, non-UK EU citizens, because at the moment we're all still EU citizens, thank goodness. May not be for much longer. All non-UK EU citizens contribute a net amount to the NHS. It's obvious, really. The vast majority of them are of working age. They don't need as much NHS treatment. Predominantly, the people who need more of it, of course, are the elderly. And you don't get that. Although we understand that people in Britain like to retire in the south of France and in Spain, we don't really get so much the other way around. People don't really come to like Britain to retire in Bognor Regis, really, if we're honest. So the vast majority of them fit and healthy, don't need that much medical care, still pay their taxes, still pay the same taxes as the rest of us to the British government, to Her Majesty's Treasury, and so there's a net gain there. So if we're telling them to bugger off, not only are we going to be having, and because we're going to have British people living overseas at the moment coming over here, or our NHS over there is going to have to start paying for their treatment, whatever, all of a sudden the NHS bill is going to go up, but the amount going into the pot is going to go down because, as I say, net benefit to the NHS of all these EU citizens. And we have been bloody rude to them. It's embarrassing, it's humiliating, and it's damaging to our country. And it's a damage that even if we elect to stay, it's a damage that will continue because as a country we've shown an ugly side to our nature, deeply ugly side, and it's horrendous. And I can agree here. There will be people in the EU who, because of this, will choose not to visit Britain, whether for a holiday or certainly for work. And they will choose not to buy British products. You know, we understand this as a society. We sometimes boycott products from certain companies or certain countries that have fallen out of favour for moral or ethical issues. Why wouldn't people in the EU do the same thing? They will. They'll look at it, made in Britain. No, boycotting British products. That's assuming we can even get it over there at a reasonable price, because obviously import tariffs will exist. So yeah. Next one. Might be the last one actually. It says the Tories have said that they'll have the most transparently costed manifesto. Why don't I believe them? Yes, it may be because they didn't cost it. Sorry, real cough. Yes, that is issue. It is. You know, they say it's the most transparently costed manifesto. It isn't, because it's not transparent. The figures don't add up. All right. Or rather, put it this way, because although we've had various biased groups having their say on both Conservative and Labour manifestos, there have been independent groups passing judgment on both, and they've found faults with both, as you would expect. With the Conservatives, there was a group of economists who effectively said they are skirting on the edge of believability with these spending plans. They are probably going to have to raise taxes. Now, the problem with that is that not only are they not going to raise taxes, but Boris Johnson is promising tax cuts. So this group that's saying, well, you might be able to get away with these spending plans if you increase tax a bit. You might just fit it into your budget. Boris Johnson saying, oh, no. I'm actually going to reduce the amount we take in taxes. I'm going to reduce the amount of money the Treasury has to spend. At which point, the only conclusion you can draw is, you can't afford all these spending plans then. And we know that because there are two reasons why we know that their manifesto is not properly costed. One is that independent economists have looked at it and gone, you cannot meet these spending plans without increasing taxes. They haven't necessarily said by a mile. Their spending plans are still less than Labour's, but they are more than current levels of taxation can afford. But the second, and we know that they're going to reduce taxation. That's the one promise they've made that we believe. And the other issue is that we know that the Conservatives do not invest in public services at all. These are the ones who cut police numbers and police stations. They're not going to significantly increase them again. They're certainly not going to make up for the amount they've cut. They may correct some of the cuts, not all of them. We know they're not going to, fund the NHS. We know that there are senior Conservatives, Boris Johnson amongst them, who are funded by donors who actively want the NHS sold off. Some of them have even said so. They've said in interviews that they want us to move to a US-based, and I'll emphasise US-based, not as it is in some other countries, private insurance healthcare system. Because it has to be borne in mind when the word insurance comes up, our current NHS model, as it always was, is an insurance-based model. It's based on, but it's based on the government effectively forcibly extracting adequate contributions so that we would, for our own benefit, so that we would have that free healthcare at point of access. So take, for example, the terrible events in America, who always have to go one better, with a number of people shot this weekend. And thankfully, as the news as I read it at the moment, no fatalities. But those people, there were 11 people, I gather, who were still injured, and they would have needed medical care. Now, what happens if you get shot and you don't have the insurance to cover that? Imagine that scenario. And that's the scenario we have to think of. You can be injured and not be able to afford the healthcare. Not really the way we work in this country, despite what the Conservatives will say and despite the impression they may even give abroad with what they say. The British public are not in tune with that. We value our NHS. We value the fact that it is free at point of access. But that will disappear, and that could disappear within 5 years if Boris Johnson gets his majority, which is why it is so important to understand that the Conservatives always run the NHS down, always, and they are never going to change that. So their spending plans are irrelevant. In fact, it makes no sense for them to cost them because they're not going to follow through. It would be wasted effort. But anyway, that's what I've got for this week. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.